He thought it was just another family dinner, until his wife took the stage and revealed the secret she had kept for 50 years. The Texas sun was setting behind the rolling hills of the Strait ranch, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson that reminded George of the countless stages he had graced over the past 5 decades. At 70 years old, the man they called the King of Country sat on his front porch, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The silence of the evening was broken only by the distant sound of cattle moving across the pasture and the gentle creaking of the wooden rocking chair that had been his father's before him. George Strait had seen it all. 60 #1 hits on the country charts, over 100 million records sold worldwide, and a legacy that had shaped the very foundation of modern country music. Yet as he watched the familiar landscape of his beloved Texas ranch, he felt a strange emptiness that all the gold records and sold-out stadiums couldn't fill. It wasn't regret exactly, but rather a growing awareness that time was slipping through his fingers like sand. The house behind him buzzed with quiet activity as Norma, his wife of over 50 years, moved about the kitchen preparing for what she had described as just a simple family dinner. Nothing fancy, she had insisted, just their son Bubba, their daughter-in-law Tamara, and their precious grandchildren. No cameras, no interviews, no record executives trying to pitch him the next big collaboration. Just family, the way it used to be before the world knew the name George Strait. He closed his eyes and let his mind drift back to 1971, when he was just a young soldier fresh out of the army, with calloused hands and a head full of dreams. Norma had been there from the beginning, standing beside him when he played those first gigs in honky-tonk bars across Texas, believing in him when he barely believed in himself. She had been his anchor through the storms of fame, his safe harbor when the pressures of the music industry threatened to sweep him away. The memory of their daughter Jennifer flickered across his mind like a shadow, as it did every evening at this time. 23 years had passed since that terrible night in 1986, when a drunk driver had stolen their 13-year-old angel from them. The pain had never fully healed, but it had taught him something precious about the fragility of time and the importance of holding close the people who truly mattered. Perhaps that was why lately he found himself thinking more about stepping back from the spotlight, about spending his remaining years right here on this land that had raised him. If you're watching this from your living room tonight, wondering if love like this still exists in our modern world, I want you to know that it does. George and Norma's story is proof that some bonds are stronger than fame, stronger than time itself. Please, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and share your own stories of enduring love in the comments below. Tell us where you're watching from, because these stories connect us all, no matter the distance. George, honey, could you help me move the dining table? Norma's voice drifted through the screen door, pulling him back to the present. At 72, she was still the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, her silver hair catching the last rays of sunlight as she appeared in the doorway. There was something different about her tonight, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. A nervous energy, perhaps, or maybe just excitement about having the family together again. "Of course, darling," he replied, setting down his coffee cup and rising from the chair with the careful movements of a man who had spent too many years on tour buses and in cramped dressing rooms. His back protested slightly, a reminder that even legends weren't immune to the passage of time. Inside the house, the dining room had been transformed. Norma had pulled out their finest china, the set they had received as a wedding gift, but rarely used. Candles flickered on the mantelpiece, and fresh wildflowers from the ranch's meadows adorned the table. It was beautiful, but it struck George as unusually elaborate for what was supposed to be a casual family dinner. "This looks mighty fancy for just the family," he observed, adjusting his position at one end of the heavy oak table that had been his grandfather's. Norma smiled, but there was something secretive in her expression. "Well, I thought it might be nice to make tonight special. We don't get together like this often enough anymore." She was right, of course. Bubba lived just a few miles away, but between George's touring schedule and the demands of running the ranch, family dinners had become increasingly rare. Even though George had significantly reduced his tour dates in recent years, choosing quality over quantity in his performances, there always seemed to be something pulling him away from home. A recording session in Nashville, a charity event he couldn't refuse, or simply the endless administrative details of managing a career that had spanned 5 decades. As they worked together to prepare the dining room, George found himself studying his wife's face. After all these years, she could still surprise him with her quiet strength and grace. She had never sought the spotlight, never demanded attention for herself, despite being married to one of the most famous men in country music. Instead, she had chosen to be his foundation, raising their children, managing their household, and providing the stability that had allowed him to build his incredible career. "Norma," he said suddenly, catching her hand as she reached for a water glass, "have I ever told you how grateful I am? For everything you've given up, everything you've done to support this crazy life of mine?" She paused, her blue eyes meeting his with an intensity that took his breath away. For a moment, he thought she might say something important, something that had been building between them for years. Instead, she simply squeezed his hand and smiled. "George Strait, after 50 years of marriage, you still know how to make an old woman feel special," she said, but her voice carried a weight that suggested deeper emotions beneath the surface. The sound of vehicles crunching on the gravel driveway announced the arrival of their family. Through the window, George could see Bubba's truck pulling up beside the house, followed by what looked like several other cars he didn't immediately recognize. His brow furrowed slightly. Norma had said it would just be immediate family, but it appeared she had invited a few more people than expected. "Honey, who else did you invite?" he asked. But Norma was already bustling toward the front door, smoothing her dress and checking her appearance in the hallway mirror. "Oh, just a few close friends," she called over her shoulder. "People who wanted to see you." George felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he got before walking onto a stage in front of thousands of people. He had learned to trust his instincts over the years, and right now those instincts were telling him that this evening was going to be anything but the quiet family dinner he had been expecting. Bubba burst through the front door with his characteristic energy, his wife Tamara close behind with their children in tow. The house immediately filled with the joyful chaos of grandchildren's laughter and excited chatter. But George noticed that his son kept glancing at Norma with what looked like barely contained anticipation, as if they shared some secret knowledge that he wasn't privy to. "Dad," Bubba said, embracing his father with genuine warmth, "Mum's been planning this for months. I think you're going to be amazed." "Planning what?" George asked. But before anyone could answer, more people began filing through the door. His longtime friend and former band member, Mike Daly, appeared with his wife. Then came Irv Woolsey, his manager for over 30 years, followed by several other faces that George recognized but hadn't expected to see on what was supposed to be a quiet family evening. "Norma," George said, turning to find his wife watching him with an expression he had never seen before. It was a mixture of love, nervousness, and something that looked almost like pride. "What exactly is going on here?" She moved to his side and took his arm, her touch gentle but firm. "George, for 50 years you've given your music to the world. Tonight I want to give something back to you, something I've been working on for a very long time." The guests were settling into the living room, their conversations creating a warm buzz of anticipation that filled the house. George noticed that someone had rearranged the furniture, creating what looked almost like a small audience seating area facing the far end of the room. His confusion deepened, but before he could ask any more questions, Norma was guiding him to a chair that had been positioned in what was clearly the place of honor. "Just trust me," she whispered in his ear, her breath warm against his cheek. "For once in our marriage, let me be the one with the surprise." As George settled into his chair, surrounded by family and friends but feeling more bewildered than he had in years, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. The woman who had stood beside him through every triumph and tragedy was planning something extraordinary, and for the first time in decades, George Strait had absolutely no idea what was coming next. 3 months earlier, Norma had sat in the same chair where George now waited, staring at a box of memories she had been collecting for decades without him ever knowing. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the lid, revealing a treasure trove of photographs, letters, and recordings that chronicled their life together in ways that even George himself had forgotten. The afternoon sun streamed through the ranch house windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits carrying memories from the past. At the top of the box lay a cassette tape labeled in her own handwriting, "George's Song for Me, April 1973. She had found it tucked away in an old shoebox in their bedroom closet, a relic from the early days of their marriage, when George would write songs late into the night, pouring his heart onto paper with nothing but a guitar and his dreams for company. This particular song had never made it onto any album, never been performed on any stage. It was too personal, too intimate, meant only for her ears during those quiet moments when the world felt too big and their love felt like the only solid thing in existence. Norma pressed play on the old boombox she had retrieved from the garage, and George's young voice filled the room, raw and unpolished, but full of the passion that would later make him a legend. The lyrics spoke of promises made under Texas stars, of a love that would outlast fame and fortune, of a woman who would be his anchor when the storms of life threatened to tear everything apart. As she listened, tears began to flow down her cheeks, not from sadness but from the overwhelming realization of how much they had lived through together. But hidden beneath that cassette was something that made her heart race with both excitement and terror. Another recording, this one labeled simply NS Practice Session Number 1, May 1973. She had almost forgotten about these tapes, made in secret during those early years when George was struggling to break into the music industry. While he was away playing small venues and trying to get noticed by record labels, she had been developing a secret of her own. Norma had always been able to sing. Even as a child growing up in Pearsall, Texas, her voice had been the one that stood out in the church choir, clear and pure with a range that surprised everyone who heard it. But growing up in the 1950s in a small Texas town, girls were taught that their voices were meant for Sunday services and lullabies, not for stages and spotlights. When she met George in high school, she had been content to be his biggest fan, the one who believed in his talent when no one else seemed to notice. What George had never known was that during those long nights when he was on the road, Norma had been writing songs of her own. Not just writing them, but recording them in their little apartment above the feed store, using a cheap recorder she had bought with money saved from her part-time job at the local diner. She had taught herself to play the piano on an old upright that the previous tenants had left behind, its keys yellowed with age, but still capable of producing beautiful music in the right hands. The songs she wrote were different from George's country ballads. They were deeply personal stories about the sacrifices women made for love, about the dreams they put on hold to support their husbands' ambitions, about finding strength in the shadows while helping someone else shine in the light. She had never intended for anyone to hear them. They were simply her way of processing the complex emotions that came with loving someone whose dreams were bigger than the small town where they had started their life together. But as the months passed and George's career began to take off, Norma found herself facing a choice she hadn't anticipated. Record labels were starting to notice George's talent, and with that attention came opportunities that would require him to spend more time away from home. There were whispers of recording contracts and tour possibilities that could launch him into the big leagues of country music. And Norma knew that if she was going to pursue her own musical dreams, it would have to be now, before George's career demanded all of their attention and energy. She had come so close to telling him. One night in late 1973, after he had returned from a particularly successful show in Austin, she had sat him down at their small kitchen table with a cup of coffee and her heart pounding in her chest. The words had been right there, ready to spill out. "George, I've been writing songs. I think I might have some talent too. Maybe we could perform together." But before she could speak, George had taken her hands in his and looked at her with such gratitude and love that she felt her resolve crumble. "Norma," he had said, "I don't know how I got so lucky to have you in my life. I know this hasn't been easy, me being gone so much, chasing this crazy dream. But knowing you're here supporting me, believing in me, that's what gives me the courage to keep going. I promise you someday, all this sacrifice will be worth it. Someday I'll be able to give you the life you deserve." In that moment, looking into his earnest brown eyes and seeing the weight of his dreams and fears, Norma had made a decision that would shape the next 50 years of their lives. She would be his foundation, his unwavering support, the steady presence that would allow him to soar as high as his talent could take him. Her own musical aspirations could wait. Love, she told herself, sometimes meant making sacrifices that no one else would ever know about. Now, sitting in that same kitchen 50 years later, Norma wondered if she had made the right choice. George had indeed become everything he had dreamed of and more. He had conquered country music, earning the respect of his peers and the adoration of millions of fans around the world. He had provided well for their family, given them financial security beyond their wildest dreams, and maintained his integrity and values throughout his incredible career. But lately, she had been feeling restless in a way she hadn't experienced since those early years. Maybe it was approaching her 73rd birthday, or maybe it was the way George had been talking about slowing down, about spending more time on the ranch, about the possibility of retirement. For the first time in decades, she found herself thinking about those songs she had written, about the voice she had kept silent for so long, about the dreams she had carefully packed away like winter clothes stored in an attic. The idea for the surprise had come to her during one of George's recent interviews, when the reporter had asked him about his legacy and what he hoped to be remembered for. George had given his usual humble response about just wanting to make music that touched people's hearts, but Norma had heard something else in his voice, a hint of melancholy, as if he was already looking back instead of forward. That's when she realized that her greatest gift to George might not be continuing to hide in the shadows, but finally stepping into the light beside him. Not to compete with his legacy, but to add a new dimension to their love story that even he didn't know existed. The thought terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Over the following weeks, Norma had begun reaching out to people from their past, carefully orchestrating what would become the most elaborate secret project of her life. She contacted Mike Daly, who had been with George since the early days and who remembered the young couple's struggles and dreams. She reached out to Irv Woolsey, George's longtime manager, who was shocked but delighted when she explained her plan. Most importantly, she had called their son Bubba and sworn him to secrecy. Bubba, who had inherited his father's musical talent and had always wondered where it came from, was amazed to learn about his mother's hidden abilities. "Mom," he had said during one of their planning sessions, "I always thought I got my musical sense just from Dad. I never knew you could sing." "There are a lot of things about me that people don't know," Norma had replied with a smile that held 50 years of untold stories. "Maybe it's time to change that." The hardest part had been the practicing. For months, Norma had been driving to a small recording studio in San Antonio, 30 miles from the ranch, where she worked with a patient piano player named James Morrison, who had agreed to help her prepare for what she was calling the performance of a lifetime. James, a retired music teacher, who had worked with several Nashville artists over the years, was amazed by Norma's natural ability and the emotion she brought to every song. "Mrs. Strait," he had told her after their first session, "you have a gift. It's been dormant for a long time, but it's still there, maybe even stronger than before because of everything you've experienced." Section 3. The lights in the living room dimmed suddenly, causing George to look up from his conversation with Mike Daly. A soft murmur rippled through the gathered guests as a white screen descended from what George now realized was a carefully concealed mechanism in the ceiling. His confusion deepened as he noticed the knowing smiles exchanged between his family members and friends. "What in the world?" George started to say, but his words were cut off as Norma's voice filled the room through speakers he hadn't noticed before. "Ladies and gentlemen, family and friends." Her voice carried a tremor of nervousness, but also a strength he had rarely heard from her in public settings. For 50 years, George Strait has been telling stories through his music. Tonight, I want to tell a story about George. George felt his heart begin to race. In all their years together, Norma had steadfastly avoided any kind of public speaking or performance. She was the one who stayed backstage, who preferred the quiet corners of award show after-parties, who always declined when reporters asked for joint interviews. This was completely unlike her, and that realization sent a chill of anticipation down his spine. The screen flickered to life, and suddenly George was looking at himself and Norma as teenagers. The photograph was one he hadn't seen in decades. They were standing outside the Pearsall High School gymnasium after a school dance, his arm around her waist, both of them grinning with the innocent joy of young love. Norma's hair was long and straight, parted in the middle in the fashion of the early 70s, and George looked impossibly young in his western shirt and carefully combed hair. "This is where it all began," Norma's voice continued as more photographs appeared on the screen. Two kids from small-town Texas, who had no idea what life had in store for them. The images progressed chronologically, each one triggering a flood of memories that George thought he had filed away permanently. There was their wedding day at the Pearsall United Methodist Church, such a small ceremony that everyone in attendance could have fit in their current living room. Norma looked radiant in her simple white dress, a dress she had sewn herself because they couldn't afford anything elaborate. George remembered how nervous he had been that day, not about marrying her, but about whether he could provide the kind of life she deserved. Then came photographs from their early years of marriage. George in his army uniform during his brief stint in Hawaii, Norma standing beside their first car, a used Chevrolet that broke down more often than it ran. There were pictures of George's first performances at honky-tonk bars across Texas, images that someone must have taken without him remembering. In several of them, Norma could be seen in the background, always watching, always supporting, but never seeking attention for herself. The video continued with the birth of their daughter Jennifer, and George felt his throat tighten as he watched footage of his baby girl taking her first steps, celebrating birthdays, learning to ride horses on the ranch. These were precious memories that became even more valuable after they lost her. Moments frozen in time that proved she had been here, that she had filled their lives with joy and laughter. But what surprised George most were the interviews woven throughout the presentation. Mike Daly appeared on screen, looking directly into the camera with obvious affection. "People don't realize how hard it was in those early days," Mike was saying. "George had the talent, but he also had something more valuable. He had Norma. She believed in him when the rest of the world hadn't figured out what we were seeing. She made it possible for him to take risks, to keep pushing forward when other men might have given up and taken a regular job." Then Irv Woolsey appeared, sitting in what looked like his Nashville office. "In 40 years of managing artists, I've never seen a partnership like George and Norma's," Irv said, with the authority of someone who had seen it all in the music business. "She never wanted credit, never asked for recognition, but she was the foundation that everything else was built on." George Strait. The legend exists because Norma Strait, the woman, made it possible. George felt tears beginning to form in his eyes as more friends and colleagues shared stories he had never heard before. Musicians talked about how Norma would quietly slip them money when they were struggling between gigs. Roadies shared memories of her treating them like family, making sure they had home-cooked meals when they were far from their own families. Fans told stories of chance encounters with Norma in grocery stores or restaurants, describing her kindness and genuine interest in their lives. But then the video took an unexpected turn. The screen showed George himself, but these were not professional photographs or concert footage. Instead, they were intimate moments captured at home. George playing guitar on the front porch, teaching Bubba to ride, working with the cattle, writing songs at the kitchen table. Someone had been documenting their private life for decades, preserving moments that felt too personal, too real to have been staged. "Who took these?" George whispered to Bubba, who was sitting nearby. His son smiled and pointed toward the kitchen, where George could see Norma silhouetted in the doorway, still speaking into a microphone he couldn't see. "Mom did, Dad. She's been keeping a record of our family for 50 years. She said someday she wanted to give it back to you." The final section of the video showed more recent footage, George receiving various awards and accolades, but always with Norma beside him, proud but reserved. There were clips from interviews where George talked about his family, about how important it was to maintain balance between his career and his personal life. In each of these clips, the camera would find Norma in the audience or backstage, watching with the quiet satisfaction of someone who knew she had played a crucial role in making those moments possible. As the video concluded, the room fell into complete silence. George looked around at the faces surrounding him. His son, his daughter-in-law, his grandchildren, his closest friends, all of them watching him with expressions of love and anticipation. He realized that everyone in this room had been part of Norma's secret project, had helped her create this tribute, without him having any idea what was happening. But before he could process everything he had just seen, the lights dimmed even further, and a spotlight illuminated a small area near the fireplace that had been transformed into an intimate performance space. A piano that definitely hadn't been there that morning sat waiting, with a microphone stand positioned nearby. George's confusion turned to complete amazement as James Morrison, whom he recognized as a respected musician from San Antonio, took his place at the piano bench. Then Norma stepped into the light. She had changed from her simple dinner dress into something George had never seen before, an elegant navy blue gown that seemed to transform her from the ranch wife he knew into someone he was seeing for the first time. Her silver hair was styled differently, swept back in a way that highlighted the classic beauty he had fallen in love with over 50 years ago. But more than her appearance, it was her presence that stunned him. She carried herself with a confidence and poise that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep inside, as if she was finally allowing the world to see a part of herself that had been hidden for decades. "George," she said, her voice now coming directly from the woman standing before him rather than through the hidden speakers. "For 50 years I've listened to you pour your heart out in song. You've shared your deepest feelings, your greatest joys, and your most profound sorrows through your music. Tonight I want to do the same for you." George felt as if the world had tilted on its axis. His wife, the woman who had never sung in public, who avoided attention and preferred to stay in the background, was standing before him ready to perform. The impossibility of the moment left him speechless. James began playing a gentle introduction, and George recognized the melody immediately. It was the song he had written for Norma in 1973, the one he had recorded on that old cassette tape late one night when he was struggling to put into words everything she meant to him. The song he had never performed for anyone else, never even mentioned to another living soul. But how did she remember it? How did she know the melody well enough to arrange it for piano? Then Norma began to sing, and George's world changed forever. Her voice was not what he expected. It wasn't the tentative, uncertain sound of someone trying something new. Instead, it was rich and mature, filled with the emotional depth that only comes from years of living and loving and losing and finding joy again. She sang his words, but she made them her own, adding subtle inflections and phrasing that revealed new meanings he hadn't realized were there. As she continued, George began to understand that this wasn't just his wife trying to sing one of his songs. This was an artist, a real artist, interpreting a piece of music with the skill and sensitivity of someone who truly understood both the technical and emotional aspects of performance, the control of her breathing, the way she used dynamics to build emotional intensity, the natural way she connected with the lyrics. These weren't things someone could fake or achieve through a few months of practice. The realization hit him like a lightning bolt. Norma could really sing. Not just carry a tune or perform adequately, but genuinely, professionally, beautifully sing. And if she could perform like this now, after decades away from music, what had she been capable of when they were young? When the last note faded into silence, the room remained completely still for what felt like an eternity. George sat frozen in his chair, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. The woman he had been married to for over 50 years, the woman he thought he knew better than anyone else in the world, had just revealed herself to be someone entirely different from who he had believed her to be. The applause, when it finally came, was thunderous. Bubba was the first to stand, tears streaming down his face as he clapped with fierce pride. The other guests followed, rising to their feet in recognition of what they had just experienced. But George remained seated, his eyes locked on Norma, who stood in the spotlight looking both vulnerable and triumphant. She walked toward him slowly, her elegant gown rustling softly with each step. When she reached his chair, she knelt beside him, taking his hands in hers just as she had done thousands of times over the years during moments of joy and sorrow. "George," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the continuing applause. "Say something, please." He looked into her eyes, searching for words that seemed to have abandoned him completely. Finally, the guests began to sense the intimate nature of the moment unfolding before them, and the applause gradually died away, leaving only the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. "How long?" he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "How long what? How long have you been able to sing like that?" Norma's eyes filled with tears as she recognized the pain behind his question. She had expected surprise, maybe even delight, but she hadn't anticipated the look of betrayal that was now clouding his features. "George, let's talk about this privately," she said, glancing around at their audience. "No," he said, his voice stronger now but still controlled. "These people have been part of your secret. They can hear my questions too." He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and careful. "How long, Norma?" She rose to face him, her chin lifting with a dignity that reminded everyone in the room why George Strait had fallen in love with this remarkable woman. "Since before I met you," she said simply. The answer hit him like a physical blow. Before she met him. That meant she had possessed this incredible talent for their entire relationship. Through all the years when he had struggled to make it in the music industry, through all the times when he had wondered if he was good enough, if he had what it took to succeed. "You could have been recording albums," he said, his voice barely controlled. "You could have been touring, performing, building your own career. Why didn't you tell me?" Bubba started to stand, perhaps sensing that this conversation was heading into dangerous territory, but Norma gestured for him to stay seated. She had started this revelation, and she was going to see it through to the end. Because I loved you, she said simply, and because in 1973 the music industry wasn't ready for married couples who were both artists. You know that as well as I do. George ran his hands through his silver hair, a gesture that everyone who knew him recognized as a sign of deep frustration. But that was 50 years ago, Norma. Things changed. The industry changed. Why didn't you ever— When? She interrupted, her own voice rising slightly. When you were struggling to get your first record deal. When you were finally getting noticed and needed all of our focus on your career. When we were raising our children and you were on the road 300 days a year. When we lost Jennifer and you needed me to hold our family together while you dealt with your grief through your music. Each question hung in the air like an accusation, but not against George. They were accusations against time itself, against circumstances, against the choices that had seemed right in each moment, but had accumulated into a lifetime of hidden dreams. There was never a right time, George, she continued, her voice softer now, but no less intense. And every year that passed, it became harder to imagine changing everything we had built together. You needed me to be your foundation, your constant. If I had pursued my own music career, even if it had been possible, it would have changed the dynamic between us completely. Mike Daly shifted uncomfortably in his seat, remembering those early days when George was fighting for recognition in an industry that could be brutal to newcomers. He had seen talented artists destroy their marriages by competing instead of complementing each other. He had also seen how rare it was to find a partner who was willing to sacrifice their own ambitions for the success of their spouse. But don't you see what you gave up? George asked, his voice breaking slightly. Don't you understand what the world lost because you kept this gift hidden? Norma reached up and touched his face gently, the same gesture she had used to comfort him through every crisis of their long marriage. The world didn't lose anything, George. The world got George Strait. And George Strait became who he is partly because he had a wife who believed in him completely, who never competed with him, who never divided his focus or energy. That's not fair to you, he said, covering her hand with his own. Fair? She repeated, and for the first time that evening she smiled with something approaching amusement. George Strait, you gave me a life that most women can only dream of. You gave me financial security, incredible experiences, the chance to travel the world and meet fascinating people. You gave me the privilege of watching the man I love achieve everything he ever dreamed of, and more. You think I've been suffering in silence all these years? Irv Woolsey found himself nodding as he listened to Norma's words. In his decades in the music business, he had seen too many cases where dual careers had destroyed relationships. The egos, the competition, the constant travel and separate schedules. It was a recipe for disaster. What George and Norma had built was rare and precious, and it had required sacrifices from both of them. But your talent, George insisted, your voice, your ability to connect with music, that's a gift that was meant to be shared. Who says it wasn't shared? Norma asked. I shared it with you every day for 50 years. I shared it with our children when I sang them lullabies and taught them to appreciate music. I shared it with our grandchildren when I helped them with their school performances. I shared it in our church choir and at family gatherings. Just because I didn't share it with the world doesn't mean it was wasted. James Morrison, who had remained seated at the piano throughout this exchange, found himself thinking about all the conversations he had had with Norma during their practice sessions over the past few months. She had never expressed regret or bitterness about her choices. Instead, she had talked about her excitement at finally being able to give George something truly meaningful, something that would show him how much his life and career had meant to her. Besides, Norma continued, who's to say that my path was the wrong one? You became the king of country music, George. You influenced generations of artists, touched millions of lives with your songs, and maintained your integrity throughout your entire career. Could you have done all of that if you had been worried about my career too? If we had been competing for studio time, for tour opportunities, for the attention of record labels? Tamara, Bubba's wife, found herself crying as she listened to this conversation. She had always admired her mother-in-law's strength and grace, but she was only now beginning to understand the depth of sacrifice and wisdom that had gone into building the Strait legacy. George was quiet for a long moment, processing everything Norma had said. The room remained silent, everyone understanding that they were witnessing something profound and private, even though it was happening in front of them. I just feel like I failed you, he finally said, his voice so quiet that people in the back of the room had to strain to hear him. "All these years I thought I was protecting you, providing for you, but I was blind to what you were giving up for me." "Oh, my darling man," Norma said, stepping closer to him and taking his face in both her hands. "You didn't fail me. You gave me the greatest gift a woman can receive. You loved me completely and let me love you the same way. You trusted me with your dreams, your fears, your heart. You made me your partner in building something beautiful and lasting." She gestured around the room at their family and friends, all of whom were watching this intimate conversation with reverence and love. "Look at what we built together, George. Look at our children, our grandchildren, the legacy you've created through your music. Look at the lives you've touched, the joy you've brought to people. I was part of all of that. Maybe I wasn't on stage beside you, but I was with you every step of the way, and that was exactly where I wanted to be." George pulled her into his arms, holding her close as the full weight of her sacrifice and love washed over him. For 50 years she had been the steady presence that had allowed him to take risks, to push boundaries, to become the artist he was meant to be, and she had done it not with resentment or regret, but with joy and pride in what they were building together. "But why now?" he whispered into her hair. "Why are you showing me this now?" Norma pulled back to look at him, her eyes bright with tears, but also with something that looked like excitement. "Because," she said, "for the first time in 50 years we have time. Your career is established, our children are grown, and we're both healthy and happy. Maybe it's time to start a new chapter in our story. Maybe it's time to finally make some music together." 6 months later, George stood in the wings of the Frank Irwin Center in Austin, Texas, feeling more nervous than he had before any performance in decades. Tonight was different from any show he had ever done. Tonight, for the first time in his legendary career, he wouldn't be walking onto that stage alone. The venue was sold out, as his concerts always were, but tonight's audience had come expecting something special. Word had somehow leaked about what the media was calling the revelation that shocked country music, though George and Norma had tried to keep the details of that magical evening at the ranch as private as possible. Still, rumors had spread through the tight-knit country music community, and speculation about what George Strait might have planned for this particular show had been building for weeks. "You ready for this, darling?" Norma asked, appearing beside him in a stunning burgundy dress that complemented the stage lighting perfectly. Over the past 6 months, she had transformed from the ranch wife who preferred to stay in the background into a confident performer, who carried herself with the poise of someone who belonged on stage. The journey to this moment hadn't been easy. After that emotional night at the ranch, George had insisted on hearing everything. All the songs Norma had written over the years, all the recordings she had made in secret, every dream she had carefully tucked away. What he discovered was a treasure trove of musical artistry that rivaled anything he had encountered in his decades in the industry. Her songs were deeply personal, telling stories of love and sacrifice, of finding strength in quiet moments, of the joys and challenges of building a life with someone whose dreams took them far from home. They were written from a woman's perspective, offering insights into the country music experience that had rarely been explored with such honesty and emotional depth. But more than the songs themselves, George was amazed by Norma's natural understanding of music theory, her instinctive ability to craft melodies that perfectly supported the emotional content of her lyrics, and her sophisticated approach to arrangement and instrumentation. These weren't the efforts of a talented amateur, but the work of a serious artist who had continued developing her craft even while keeping it hidden from the world. The first step had been bringing in Tony Brown, the legendary producer who had worked with George on some of his most successful albums. Tony's reaction to Norma's demo recordings had been immediate and enthusiastic. "George," he had said, after listening to just 3 of her songs, "this isn't just good music. This is important music. These songs say things that need to be said, and they say them in a way that could change how people think about relationships, about sacrifice, about what it means to build a life together." They had started small, recording a duet version of the song that George had originally written for Norma back in 1973. But this new arrangement transformed it into something entirely different, a conversation between 2 voices, 2 perspectives on the same love story, each adding depth and meaning to the other's words. When they played the finished recording for their family, the response was overwhelming. Bubba, who had inherited his parents' musical abilities and had been pursuing his own career in music, was amazed by the chemistry between his parents' voices. "Mom, Dad," he had said, shaking his head in wonder, "you don't just sound good together, you sound like you were meant to sing together. How did we never know this?" The decision to perform publicly had been Norma's idea. After months of working in the studio, she had begun to feel the same pull toward performance that had driven George's career from the beginning. Not the desire for fame or recognition, but the need to connect with people through music, to share the stories that had been living in her heart for so many years. "I want to know what it feels like," she had told George one evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in brilliant colors. "I want to know what it's like to stand on a stage and feel that connection with an audience that you've talked about all these years." George had been hesitant at first. The thought of exposing Norma to the intensity of public performance, to the scrutiny that came with being in the spotlight, made him protective in a way he hadn't felt since their children were small. But when he saw the determination in her eyes, the same look she had worn when she decided to support his dreams all those years ago, he knew he couldn't stand in her way. The plan they developed was perfect in its simplicity. Midway through his regular concert set, George would tell the audience about the surprise he had discovered in his own living room 6 months earlier. Then Norma would join him on stage for their duet, followed by a solo performance of one of her original songs. "Ladies and gentlemen," George's voice now carried across the packed arena, "50 years ago, I married the most amazing woman in Texas. I thought I knew everything there was to know about her. 6 months ago, she proved me wrong." The audience stirred with anticipation as George told an abbreviated version of the story, describing the surprise that had changed his understanding of the woman he had been married to for half a century. When he mentioned that Norma had been hiding a remarkable musical talent for their entire relationship, the crowd's excitement was palpable. "Tonight," George continued, "I want to share something with you all that I've never shared with anyone before. This is a song I wrote for my wife when we were young and poor and full of dreams. Back then it was just for her. Tonight it's for all of you, and she's going to help me sing it." The opening notes of the piano arrangement filled the arena as James Morrison, who had become an integral part of their musical collaboration, began the gentle introduction. Then George's familiar voice began the first verse, singing words that had been private between him and Norma for 50 years. When Norma's voice joined his for the chorus, 20,000 people fell completely silent. Her voice, amplified and supported by the professional sound system, revealed its full power and beauty. The blend of their voices was magical, George's weathered baritone and Norma's clear, emotion-rich soprano, creating harmonies that seemed to tell the story of their entire relationship in musical form. As the song continued, something extraordinary happened. The audience began to sense that they were witnessing something historically significant, not just in George Strait's career, but in country music itself. This wasn't just a surprise guest appearance or a novelty duet. This was the revelation of an artist who had been hiding in plain sight for decades, someone whose story and voice represented experiences that had rarely been captured in country music. When the duet ended, the applause was deafening, but George raised his hand for quiet. "Now I want you to hear something that no one has ever heard before," he said. "This is one of my wife's songs, written in her own voice, telling her own story. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the woman who has been my partner in everything for 50 years, Norma Strait." As George stepped back and Norma moved to center stage alone, the arena fell silent again. This was her moment, the culmination of a dream that had been deferred for half a century. She began to sing a song she had written called "The Long Way Home," a powerful ballad about the choices women make when they love someone whose dreams require sacrifice and support. The lyrics spoke of finding purpose in being someone else's foundation, of discovering strength in stepping back so someone else could shine, of learning that love sometimes means making yourself smaller so something bigger can grow. But as the song progressed, it became clear that this wasn't a lament about missed opportunities. Instead, it was a celebration of chosen love, of purposeful sacrifice, of the deep satisfaction that comes from helping build something beautiful and lasting. The chorus spoke of taking the long way home to happiness, acknowledging that her path had been different from what she might have originally planned, but insisting that it had led her exactly where she belonged. When the final note faded away, the silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then, as if on cue, the entire arena erupted. People were on their feet, many crying openly, all recognizing that they had just witnessed something that transcended entertainment and moved into the realm of genuine human truth. George returned to center stage and took Norma's hand, raising it above their heads in acknowledgement of the audience's response. In that moment, they weren't just a legendary country star and his wife. They were partners in every sense of the word, two artists whose individual talents had been enhanced by their deep love and respect for each other. Backstage after the show, the dressing room was filled with well-wishers and industry professionals who wanted to congratulate Norma on her debut performance. Record label executives were already talking about recording contracts and tour possibilities, but Norma just smiled and deflected their attention back to George. Later, as they drove home to the ranch under a canopy of Texas stars, George reached over and took Norma's hand. "So," he said with a grin, "how did it feel?" Norma was quiet for a moment, still processing the incredible rush of connecting with such a large audience, of feeling their energy and emotion flowing back to her from the darkness beyond the stage lights. "It felt," she said finally, "like coming home." 3 years later, George and Norma Strait released their first full album together, a collection of songs that told the story of their 50-year journey from different perspectives. The album, titled The Long Way Home, debuted at #1 on the country charts and earned them a Grammy nomination for Best Country Duo Group Performance. But more importantly, it opened up conversations throughout the country music community and beyond about the sacrifices that partners make for each other's dreams, about the different ways people can find fulfillment and purpose, and about the beauty of love that evolves and deepens over decades of shared experience. Their story became an inspiration for countless couples who had thought their own dreams were over, proving that it's never too late to discover new aspects of yourself or to begin new chapters in a long relationship. It showed that sometimes the most beautiful gifts are the ones we keep hidden until the perfect moment to share them arrives. George continued touring and recording, but now many of his shows included appearances by Norma, either performing their duets or presenting her own songs. She never overshadowed his career or competed for attention, but instead added a new dimension to the Strait legacy that enriched everything they had built together. And on quiet evenings at the ranch, when the work was done and the grandchildren had gone home, George and Norma could often be found on their front porch, making music together as the Texas sun set behind them. Sometimes they sang the old songs, the ones that had made George famous. Sometimes they performed the new material they were working on together. And sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence. Two people who had learned that the deepest love is found not in grand gestures or public declarations, but in the quiet moments when two hearts beat in perfect harmony, creating a music that only they could hear. The legend of George Strait had become the legend of George and Norma Strait, proving that some stories are even more beautiful when they're finally told in full, with all the voices that made them possible singing together at last.